In 1743, an entire 40,000-man army, led by a king, was perfectly trapped and destined for annihilation. They were starving, surrounded, and being torn apart by cannons from a position they couldn't possibly attack. By all logic, they should have been wiped from history. Instead, they won. This is the incredible story of how one of the most brilliant military traps ever devised was shattered by a single moment of arrogance and one king's impossible courage. It all began in June of that year, with a king not on a throne of gold, but on a simple campaign stool, staring at a map. He was surrounded not by courtesans, but by the mud and grit of war. This was King George II of Great Britain, Elector of Hanover, a man in his 60th year. He was short-tempered, meticulous, stubborn as granite, and possessed a fiery conviction that a king's place was at the head of his men. To many of his British subjects, he was still a foreigner, more German than English, but he was determined to prove himself a warrior in the mold of the legendary Plantagenets. He was about to get his chance. On the other side of the River Main, a man of a completely different temperament watched his every move. Marshal Adrien Maurice, the Duc de Noailles, was a creature of the French court, a peer of France, a brilliant and patient strategist. He was a chess master playing on a board of rivers and forests, and his pieces were 40,000 allied soldiers. He was slowly, methodically, and masterfully weaving a perfect trap. The continent was ablaze, all because of a sprawling fight over a queen's right to her throne, a conflict that had dragged kings and kingdoms into its vortex. But for the soldiers of the pragmatic army, the grand politics of Vienna and Paris were a distant echo. They were an army formed to uphold that queen's claim, a volatile, multilingual mix of red-coated British infantry, staunch Hanoverians, and white-coated Austrians. Their command was a mess, a council of bickering generals who couldn't agree on a plan, all overruled by a king who trusted his gut more than their maps. For weeks, their reality had been a miserable slog through the German countryside. Their objective was the city of Hanau, where vital supplies and much-needed reinforcements awaited. Their path followed the north bank of the River Main, a corridor of land hemmed in by the water on their left and dense, impassable forests on their right. Every day was the same, a grueling march through mud, with rations growing thinner and thinner until men were chewing on leaves just to stave off the pangs of hunger. Every day, the soldiers grew weaker. And with every step, the French marshal's invisible cage grew stronger around them. All the while, from the opposite bank, the Duc de Noailles watched them. His army of 50,000 Frenchmen did not merely shadow the Allies, it controlled them. With the impassable river separating the two forces, Noailles used his superior numbers and strategic position to orchestrate his enemy's movements. His light cavalry, swift and deadly hussars, would cross the river at will, raiding the Allied supply lines and cutting down any foraging parties that strayed too far from the main column. He was slowly starving them, bleeding them, and herding them. Every road leading away from the river was blocked by French detachments. Every potential source of food was secured. The pragmatic army was being funneled deeper and deeper into a valley that was steadily, inexorably, becoming a cage. The tension in the Allied camp was a poison, as generals from different nations mistrusted one another. They were marching for the promise of bread and ammunition in Hanau, blinded by their own desperation. Noailles had dangled the bait, and they had taken it. Every grueling step brought them closer not to salvation, but to a perfectly designed slaughterhouse. From a hill overlooking the river, the Duc de Noailles watched the Allied column stretch for miles below him, a long, vulnerable serpent of men and wagons. It was a sight of pure military perfection. Every road was blocked, every cannon was placed, and 40,000 men were walking into a grave they could not yet see. His plan was a masterwork, a beautiful and brutal piece of strategic art, as elegant in its conception as it was lethal in its intent. It was a mousetrap, designed to snap shut with merciless finality. The mechanism was comprised of three perfectly synchronized elements. The first was the hammer. Far ahead of the Allied vanguard, hidden behind the marshy banks of the Forbach stream, lay the village of Dettingen. There, concealed from view, waited 29,000 French troops. This force was commanded by the Marshal's own nephew, the fiery and ambitious Duc de Gramont. They were the blocking force, the wall that would halt the Allied advance and pin them in place. Their position was formidable. The boggy stream would disorder any charge, turning an organized attack into a floundering struggle. The second element was the anvil. As the pragmatic army reeled from its collision with the hammer at Dettingen, a second French force of 12,000 men would make its move. They were already constructing pontoon bridges in secret, preparing to cross the River Main behind the Allies, smashing into their rear guard and cutting off any possibility of retreat. Caught between these two forces, the Allied army would be compressed, unable to maneuver, a helpless mass of men. The third and most devastating element was the fire. All along the south bank of the river, opposite the narrow plain where the Allies would be trapped, Noailles had positioned the pride of his army, his elite artillery. French cannons were the envy of Europe, and his gunners were masters of their craft. They had hauled dozens of heavy guns into carefully prepared positions, giving them a clear, unobstructed line of fire into the flank of the entire Allied army. When the trap was sprung, this line of cannons would unleash a storm of iron, a relentless and inescapable crossfire that would tear the enemy ranks to shreds from a direction they could not possibly fight back. The plan was flawless. The trap was set. What could possibly go wrong? This is the kind of high-stakes historical drama we love to uncover. If you agree, make sure you're subscribed to our channel so you don't miss what happens next. For the Allied commanders, the morning of June 27th began with the dawning horror of discovery. As their vanguard approached the seemingly peaceful village of Dettingen, they saw them. The sun glinted off thousands upon thousands of French bayonets, a sea of white-coated infantry blocking the path to Hanau. The hammer was in place. Almost simultaneously, frantic reports flooded in from the rear. Another large French force was crossing the river behind them. The anvil was swinging into position. And then, from across the river, came a roar of thunder. The French cannons opened up. The air filled with the sound of tearing canvas as iron balls ripped through the Allied ranks. Men were eviscerated where they stood. Horses screamed and fell, their legs shattered. The narrow plain became a killing field. The orderly columns dissolved into chaos as men dove for cover that did not exist. Their situation was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. Enemy to the front, enemy to the rear. An impassable river on their left and wooded hills on their right. And all the while, French artillery was bleeding them white, untouchable from across the water. In a hastily assembled council of war, the grim-faced generals gathered around King George. The sound of cannon fire was a constant, percussive reminder of their mortality. To stay put meant a slow, agonizing death under the French guns. To advance on Dettingen meant launching a frontal assault against a numerically superior enemy entrenched in a powerful defensive position. It was suicide. Their only conceivable option, a desperate gamble, was to turn the entire army around and attempt to fight their way out through the smaller French force to their rear. It was a decision born of pure desperation, an attempt to escape one threat by charging headlong into another. They still failed to grasp the true strength of the force hidden at Dettingen, believing it to be a mere detachment. Noailles' deception was complete. His trap was primed, the jaws wide open, and the bait had been taken. The order was simple, direct from the marshal himself. Hold the line. Let them come to you. The defensive position behind the marshy stream was a gift. It would break the momentum of any enemy charge, forcing them into a bottleneck where they could be destroyed at leisure. But for the Duc de Gramont, nephew to Noailles, glory felt too close to wait for. Staring across the field at the chaotic maneuvering of the Allied army, he saw not a trap to be sprung, but a victory waiting to be seized. Gramont was a man carved from the marble of French aristocracy, arrogant, fiery, and consumed by a desperate need to earn a reputation outside his uncle's colossal shadow. He commanded the finest cavalry in the world, the legendary Maison du Roi, the household troops of the French king. These were not mere soldiers, they were noblemen, princes of the blood, who saw battle as a stage for personal valor. They believed it was their right to charge, to be the first to break the enemy, and they chafed under the command of a strategist who valued patience over glory. As the pragmatic army began its clumsy, lumbering turn to face the threat to their rear, The entire formation seemed to dissolve into a vast cloud of dust and confusion. To Gramont's impatient eyes, this complex redeployment looked like the beginning of a rout. He saw standards moving away, columns tangling, and he convinced himself the enemy was breaking. This was his moment. In a breathtaking act of insubordination, he chose to disobey the explicit, hand-delivered orders of his commander and uncle. He would not wait. He would attack. He gave the command, and the French drums began to beat a furious rhythm. In his lust for glory, he was about to make the single biggest mistake of his life and turn a certain victory into a bloodbath. From his vantage point, the Duc de Noailles watched through his spyglass in utter disbelief, his heart turning to ice. He saw the banners of the Maison du Roi dip, the signal for a charge. He saw the entire French line begin to surge forward, abandoning the safety of the stream. His flawless plan, his perfect, inescapable trap, a work of strategic genius years in the making, was being shattered by the very man he had entrusted to execute its most crucial part. His nephew had thrown away every advantage. The high ground, the defensive barrier, the element of surprise, all of it was gone, traded for a reckless, headlong rush for glory. The battle would now be a simple, brutal brawl, a bloody test of raw courage and discipline, exactly the kind of fight Noailles had so cleverly sought to avoid. The marshal could only watch in horror as the screaming wave of 30,000 French soldiers surged forward, the elite cavalry of the Maison du Roi at their head. A glittering tide of polished steel and embroidered banners. The trap was abandoned. The battle had begun, not on the marshal's terms, but on the whim of one fatally ambitious man. The ground shook as 30 squadrons of the Maison du Roi slammed into the Allied front. The initial impact was a terrifying cataclysm of horseflesh and steel, a collision that buckled the British lines and sent a shockwave of panic through the ranks. In the center of this chaos, King George II's horse, a high-strung thoroughbred maddened by the deafening roar of cannons and muskets, suddenly bolted. It reared violently, its eyes wide with terror, and galloped uncontrollably toward the rear, carrying the King of England away from the battle. An army's spirit can break seeing its king flee the field. The battle, and the kingdom, was on the verge of collapse, but George II was not about to run. Fighting the panicked animal to a stop with the help of his aides, the 59-year-old king did the unthinkable. He dismounted. The thud of his boots on the muddy ground was a different sound than the thunder of cannons. It was the sound of a choice. He was no longer a target on a horse. He was a soldier, standing shoulder to shoulder with his men. He drew his sword, its polished blade catching the morning sun, and began to stride on foot back towards the front line of his infantry. His personal bravery was like a lightning strike. The common soldiers, men who had likely never seen a king before, stared in disbelief and then roared with approval. He walked along the line of red-coated infantry, shouting encouragement, his German accent thick, but his meaning unmistakable. "Now, boys," he famously yelled, "now for the honor of England. Fire and behave brave, and the French will soon run." His presence worked a miracle. The wavering lines of infantrymen solidified, their discipline reasserted by the sheer, stubborn courage of their king. The battle now devolved into a brutal, close-quarters struggle. The elite French cavalry, the pride of their nation, charged again and again, confident that they could break the peasant infantry. But they crashed against a wall of British and Hanoverian bayonets and a relentless, rolling thunder of musketry. The Allied platoon firing system was a machine of death. It was a technique born from endless drilling on parade grounds, and it was devastatingly effective. As one rank of men fired a volley, they would kneel to reload while the rank behind them fired, and then the one behind them, creating a continuous, disciplined storm of lead that the French charges could not penetrate. It was a clash of military philosophies, the individual, glorious charge of the French nobleman versus the collective, mechanical firepower of the disciplined British soldier. Again and again the Maison du Roi charged, and again they were broken. Horses and riders went down in screaming heaps, their gilded armor and fine uniforms torn apart by musket balls. In the midst of the carnage, the king's own son, the Duke of Cumberland, was shot in the leg, the musket ball tearing a ragged hole through his calf. Yet, He refused to leave the field, propping himself up against a command post and continuing to issue orders, his face pale with pain. The tide began to turn. The costly charges of the French cavalry finally faltered. Battered, bloodied, and having lost their aura of invincibility, they began to fall back in disarray. Seeing the enemy break, the Allied infantry, with their king still among them, let out a massive cheer and began to advance. The line had held. The hunters had become the hunted. The advance became a rout. What began as an orderly French retreat quickly collapsed into a panicked scramble for the bridges over the Main. The elite cavalry, in their haste to escape, crashed into their own advancing infantry regiments, causing a massive, chaotic pileup of men and horses. Order and discipline vanished, replaced by a primal instinct for survival. Soldiers who had charged with visions of glory only an hour before were now throwing down their muskets and running for their lives. The bridges became bottlenecks of terror. Men were pushed and trampled in the desperate crush to cross to safety. Many, seeing no other escape, plunged into the river, where the swift current dragged them under, their heavy wool coats pulling them down to a watery grave. The pontoon bridges themselves, never designed to hold the weight of a panicked army, began to break apart, casting hundreds of screaming men into the water to drown. The French army, so perfectly positioned for a masterpiece of a victory, was now utterly broken, undone not by the enemy, but by a single moment of colossal arrogance. On the battlefield they left behind, the pragmatic army stood victorious. But they were utterly exhausted, battered, and in no condition to pursue their shattered enemy. They had won, but they had paid a heavy price in blood. The field was a grotesque tapestry of color, the scarlet of the British, the white of the French and Austrians, and the blue of the Hanoverians, all scattered across the green grass. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the cries of the wounded. Surgeons worked frantically, their saws grimly at work. The soldiers who had survived stood in stunned silence, leaning on their muskets, scarcely believing that they had lived through the day, let alone won it. It was a strange and complicated triumph. It was a blundering, accidental win, born from French impatience and saved by the raw, stubborn courage of the common soldier and his king. It was one of the greatest ironies in military history. The Duc de Noailles had devised the perfect plan to destroy an army and was defeated entirely by his own side. He had accounted for every move the enemy could make, but he had not accounted for the reckless ambition of his own nephew. After the battle, the marshal could only survey the wreckage of his army, his face a mask of bitter disappointment. The legacy of the battle was immediate and profound. It saved the pragmatic army from certain annihilation and sent a shockwave of confidence through the Allied cause. Back in London, the news was greeted with delirious celebration. The great composer, George Friedrich Handel, was commissioned to write his famous Dettingen Te Deum to commemorate the glorious victory. The battle cemented the legend of King George II, who would go down in history as the last reigning British monarch to personally lead his troops into combat. He was not a brilliant general, but on that day, in that moment of crisis, he had been a true leader, a king who had earned the respect of his men by sharing their danger. The history books call it a victory, but it was chaos. It wasn't a triumph of strategy, but a testament to the fact that the perfect plan is no match for human nature, both the reckless pride that can destroy an army and the stubborn courage that can save one. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important battles aren't won on a map, but in the heart of a single soldier who refuses to break. If you want to see more stories about the incredible battles that shaped our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.